All right, welcome back to the Dallas International Film Festival. You're with Selig Polyscope, Selig Film News. We are talking to Mike Blizzard and Lara Morgan, the director and one of the producers of Also Starring Austin, one of the documentaries that we've got here this year. You guys, welcome. Thanks for coming up. Appreciate you being here.
Yes, thank you.
Well, we got to talk a little bit previous to this, but let's kind of begin at the beginning. Like, Mike, what sparked the idea for this?
Well, I was in a sort of ongoing conversation with a friend just about, like, what are the best movies shot in Austin, and we would come up with, have you seen this or that? And we've got some really good local video stores that carry a lot of more rare films, Vulcan Video, I Love Video in Austin. And then I went to the Austin Film Society, they were honoring Meatloaf that year as one of the inductees in the Texas Film Hall of Fame. An interesting choice. But
I actually walked him on the red carpet that year.
Did you really?
I was at that event.
That is great. Yeah, I mean, Rocky Horror Picture Show, he should probably get in just for that. But he was in this film called Roadie, and so in the days leading up to it, they would show films associated with people that were being awarded, and they had an event where they showed Roadie. Now, as Lewis Black says in our movie, Roadie's not a great movie, but it's interesting. And it's very, very local, even though it was a Hollywood movie. And so there's a scene in there where they're a chase scene through downtown. It's 1980. And you could feel everyone in the Alamo Drafthouse wanting to press pause to see what downtown was like at that time. And like, was this business there or not? And it looked so different. And I just walked out of there and I was like, gosh, wouldn't it be interesting there's been so many movies filmed in Austin, to string together scenes of similar places and watch how they've changed over time. And that was just the initial spark of an idea. And Lara Morgan was a apprentice at the Film Society at the time, and someone had told me, my now niece's husband told me I should talk to her because she would be really into this project. And so we just started watching movies, and we started to realize there was something more going on here than just physical change to the city. The city has a certain character, a certain culture that is very much evidenced in these films.
I really like how you literally begin at the very beginning of Austin film, footage from the old parades that happen downtown and everything. And I'm wondering, is either of you a film historian? Who did you kind of collaborate with on to get that footage, get that information?
That was Allison McCord, who's interviewed in the film. She wrote a book called Chainsaws, Slackers, and Spy Kids, History of Filmmaking in Austin. And that's more industry focused, but it's a great resource of a book. And she was the one she has a chapter in there about the silent film era in Austin, which I was completely unaware of and I found fascinating. And so none of the commercial films that came out at that time are still around, but the Tilley brothers also just shot home movie stuff all the time. So they shot, Congress Avenue, 7th Street. This was 100 years ago. And so we were able to have her sort of narrate that section of that first film scene in Austin.
Yeah, with footage from Tammy.
Yes, and the footage is from the Texas Archive of the Moving Image, and we had seen them put on a presentation, and part of it was showing all these old films from that era.
That's what I was wondering, if you guys were collaborating with Tammy on this. I actually went to an event that they had sponsored, and they were collecting people's old materials, and they'll transfer them to DVD for you, and they just want to archive it all and get a sense of what's going on. And I remember asking one of the people who worked there, okay, so what's the most interesting, the weirdest thing you guys have collected? And she said, well, we got some old parade footage of a Shriner parade, way back in the day. I was like, oh, okay, well, that's cool. And she goes, it was a trunk full of silver nitrite reels that they'd had in their basement for something like 60 years.
Wow.
I'm like, oh, that is an interesting find. It's we're just going to call the bomb squad to come pick that up from your house, and we will archive it later when it is rendered safe. But yeah, so Texas Archive of the Moving Image doing some interesting work here in the Lone Star State.
we actually had some other stuff from them that didn't make it in the film. They had interviews with Dennis Quaid when he made DOA, the interview with Bill Whitliff, who wrote Red-Headed Stranger, and that didn't end up in the final cut, but there was a show, the Carolyn Jackson Show, where she would interview sort of Hollywood stars with Texas connections. And so Tammy is just this incredible resource. You can go to their website, texasarchive.org, I think it is, and find all sorts of stuff.
So, was it always the idea to work with the archive? Because I was kind of like, well, when you're doing something like this, there's so many different angles that you could take on it. Like, when somebody says, oh, well, this is a movie about Austin film, I think most people would probably go, oh, so, like, it's about, like, Dazed and Confused? Like, well, yeah, but it's a much broader scope than that. So you chose to begin at the beginning and move forward kind of by decade and by film movement. So, yeah, tell us a little bit more about crafting that story.
Well, so then there's a 50-year gap, between the time that those silent movie films were made and then when Tobe Hooper really sparked the modern era of film in Austin. And he started filming that film Eggshells in 1969. And this was his film he made before the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Right.
And once Chainsaw became a big hit, that sort of really kicked off an interest of Austin as a film town. But at that time, if you were successful, the first thing you did was go to Hollywood. You didn't stay in Austin. And I think, so we intentionally, like Richard Linklater in this movie, even though if you asked a person on the street in Austin, what's the first movie that was shot in Austin, they'd probably say Slacker or Dazed and Confused.
Dazed and Confused, yeah.
And so we intentionally, he doesn't show up till halfway through the movie.
Yeah, much later in the film.
Yeah, because there was decades of films being made in Austin before he even, moved there.
But he was the one who kind of made it. You can film here, and then you can stay here and keep filming here, and that's a big deal. But it's kind of, we wanted people to be reeled in by him, and then watch the movie and kind of forget that you're going to get to him eventually. And then when he shows up, oh right, that's the reason why I watched this movie in the first place.
Absolutely.
And then, I had no idea about all this other stuff leading up to it.
Yeah, I noticed that. We didn't dwell on it too much in the film, that we joked about it a little bit last night. Austin's got a little bit of a weird relationship with California right now. Well, and apparently we always have.
Yeah.
Of either you're successful and you move to California, or you get sick of California, you come back to Austin. And it's South by Southwest, of course. We see that all the time. But anyway, Lara's a California girl, and we're happy that she's here. You're not anymore, you're not. You're an Austin girl now.
I've lived in Austin longer than I've lived anywhere.
Okay, well then I call that a win.
Okay.
I noticed some of the other cultural bits about Austin that kind of made their way in there, like the running joke about like whenever you got to Austin, you just missed it, like, or it was over 5 minutes ago or something like that. So what are some of the cultural movements that have really meant a lot to you that you wanted to make sure had a bit in this film?
I think the biggest thing is probably music, and that you see a lot more music, people playing music in Austin movies than you do elsewhere, because that's a big part of Austin, that there's sort of live music everywhere. It's called the live musical capital of the world. A lot of people dispute that or don't like that saying, but there's definitely a lot of music, and that sort of works its way into these films, and especially because many of the filmmakers were musicians themselves, and so they were going back and forth between these two worlds, and Willie Nelson obviously being the most prominent example of that. But even in Slacker that we were mentioning before, the woman who's got Madonna's pap smear, she was in Butthole Surfers, and the guy who takes over the apartment at one time was in a band called Glass Eye, and he's the one who takes over the guy who's disappeared apartment. And so even in that movie, the music and film scenes were sort of coming together to create art.
And funnily enough, our editor is the lead singer of a band, and that's her. And we know a lot of editors actually who they edit and then they go play their gigs, and so.
That's a very Austin thing to do. Everybody's in the band except me. I'm not.
Yeah, I have no musical talent.
We could make bands.
Okay, cool.
Here, I don't know what we would call it.
All tambourines.
That's awesome. That's perfect. I like it. Okay, so we're talking about, moving forward through the decades and everything. To a point, did you get to kind of the sense of, okay, we have so much material, where do we start filtering, editing, if you will?
Well, some of it was we expected to spend more time on certain things that without a narrator, you have to just go on what the interviewees say. And
Sure.
so there were things that we thought would be way more prominent that no one really had much to say very much about. It wasn't discussed. We would try and prompt, and if there wasn't too much, that meant probably it didn't have that significant role in the culture and the history. So there were things I think that we both thought would come up more that didn't, and so that kind of would help whittle that down. And sometimes it was sad, and I think Office Space is something we expected to talk about more, but there wasn't too much to be. It was just kind of a movie that kind of came in and then left. And but I'll let you talk more about it.
Yeah, I think that it's like in a documentary, it's sort of a journey. Like what you expect the movie to be when you start is not what it ends up being in the end.
Sure.
Because the material sort of tells its own story. So the movies tell a story about Austin, and then the people we interviewed tell their story, and you start to weave that together. That said, the first cut of this film was 3.5 hours long. So I did not believe at one point we would ever
So there is
get
more
down.
material, y'all.
Oh yes, oh yeah. We've watched over 200 films that were shot in Austin, in and around Austin, and so there's a ton of material, and there was things that we really liked in longer versions of the film that we had to get rid of. But I think at this point it just moves so much quicker, and it flows well, I think, and that wasn't the case in longer versions. People would say, I like these parts, but it's just not, it's tiring me out, It didn't have a good structure to it. And so it was really, we had I think about 2 hour and 10 minute version, and we showed to people, and it did not go over particularly well. And so we just completely went back to the drawing board and re-outlined the film. And one of the smartest things that we did that I highly recommend to everybody is we had every interview transcribed, so that when you need to make changes, you can go back and read the interviews rather than watching through them, look for keywords, when did they talk about this or that. So we had every film logged and then every interview transcribed, so we were able to, on paper, outline the film and then try that in practice visually.
Well, that's commitment right there, because I interned with Publishing House, and transcription is not an easy, fun task that everybody volunteers for.
Yeah.
So props to you for doing that.
It took a while.
I believe you.
My first interview through, I decided to transcribe all the ums. That was
Been there?
Yeah.
Been there?
Dropped that pretty early on. Like, oh, wait, this is a waste of time. No one's going to be searching like, oh, when did they say in the
Oh, yeah.
in the
I had
Toby
to
Hooper interview?
break myself with the parentheses, pause.
Yeah.
Just like, no one cares about
Unnecessary.
that. Yeah. Well, one thing I really like about this movie is you can tell that it's made by Austinites, because the people that appear in it are not just the obvious choices. Like, people say Austin film, like I said, think Dazed and Confused. So Richard Linklater and Willie Nelson and Robert Rodriguez. And that would be kind of most people's summary of it. But that really leaves out really massive figures of the Austin film scene that are kind of averse to the spotlight. Like kind of the godfather of Austin film, Louis Black, has a big part in there. And because he's not into that whole, press scene, he's not on social media, he's not someone that everybody thinks of, but he is incredibly knowledgeable just on Austin culture, not just film. So what did he think of this project, getting in there with you?
Well, Louis is a film geek. He knows Austin history, like you said. He knows Austin films probably as comprehensively as anybody.
Sure.
Especially, Wayne Bell, who's also in there, the sound guy, I would also put in a category like that, because he was sort of on the ground working on every single one of those films. But Louis has always been excited about the project. He hasn't seen it yet, and no one who's in the film has seen it.
Yeah.
And so we have tested it with other local filmmakers and friends and things like that. But because once we opened up that thing. We'd have to show it to all of.
As I say, I
people.
smell a hometown premiere coming on.
Oh yeah, we're gonna do a big hoo-ha in Austin and have a bunch of people out. But Lewis is an incredibly supportive person, just generally. I mean,
Absolutely.
he helped us get Toby Hooper. He flew. Toby and he were friends. Unfortunately, Toby passed away last year, but he flew him to Austin. We all went out to. He interviewed him for the film, and took everyone to dinner. We called it Toby Week or Toby Weekend because we got to know him, and that's how we met Wayne Bell. I had heard of Wayne Bell, who's a known sound guy in Austin, but again, he's not the type of person you'd think, oh, we've got to interview him. But I sat next to him at the dinner, and he starts telling the stories, but he's telling them twice as good as Toby did, and a better memory. And he used to be a radio DJ, so his voice is great. And about halfway through the dinner, I said, "Can we interview you, like next week?"
It's like, can I get my iPhone out? We're gonna run a voice memo on this.
Yeah, can we get this on the record right now? So there are people like that. Kerry White, who's a production designer, set designer, and he built the town of Luck for Willie Nelson,
Right.
which was in Red-Headed Stranger, and then was used in a bunch of other movies. So these were people that, in some ways, we would talk to people and they'd say, oh, you know who you really need to talk to is Kerry White. And he played a great role. He was also Friday Night Lights. And what else? Bunch of movies, Spy Kids and others.
Yeah.
So these are the people that are not really out in the media. They're behind the scenes, but because they were working, actually on the set and there day in and day out, they know these movies extremely well, and they've worked on a ton of them.
And I like that there are different types of movies getting featured there. Like there's a bit of The Big Green that was a huge deal when I was a kid, one of my favorite movies as a kid. And of course, Spy Kids is from Austin. But also, Bob Byington was in there as well. And I'm kind of like, he is not into the whole big, flashy, spotlight movie scene. And so I thought it was really cool that you're kind of like, no, this is our group. We're in here together. I love it.
Bob is a really funny character. So Bob was extremely supportive, said we could come to his house to do the interview. That's his house that we're interviewing him. And he said, but the Zellners have to do it with me. And we wanted to do them anyway. We were going to do the two brothers.
Sure.
And so Bob sets up the whole thing. He gets them on board in the house.
He brings in Starbucks coffee for everybody. Like, that's the only time we had that on any
Hey,
set.
man, if that's what you're about, then...
Yeah. And then Bob, of course, and then the interview starts and he just begins to clam up immediately and do things like, as you'll notice... So we hardly ever show reaction shots from Bob in that interview because he's always doing something weird while it's
make it a whole
happening.
different movie.
And so, but he had great stuff, and they were fun because they also commented on other people's movies.
Sure.
And so they talked about their favorite movies. Blood Simple, the first Coen Brothers movie, which we feature prominently. Most people don't know that was shot in Austin, and because of the University of Texas connection there. And so they were able to they had a funny rapport about them that they could pepper these other sections of the film with their commentary that wasn't just about their films.
Laura, tell me a little bit more about, we discussed it last night, but kind of the premier female producer of our time, spent a little time with you. Tell me about how you met her and setting up her bit.
So Elizabeth Avion, who's produced, Spy Kids, Machete.
She's the action film producer.
Yeah, exactly. Grindhouse. I showed up to her office, and Mike was running late, as he is wont to do, as we both were to this interview today. So I was there with the DP, and we're kind of trying to figure out where to sit, and I'm really flushed, and it's probably the first day that I was there, because besides that, I basically was Mike's assistant, whatever needs help on the day of, but this was the first time that I was kind of making some decisions. And I asked her where she thought would be the best place to interview, and she said, "You're a female producer?" And I said, yeah, I'm the associate producer on this movie. And she said, "I trust your judgment." And I was like, okay, which was amazing and put a lot of pressure on. But it was really cool. That was my favorite moment. I mean, it was very cool interviewing Willie Nelson and all these kind of, iconic people. But for me, that was like, and especially because in Austin, sadly, a lot of the interviews that we have are a lot of older men, and it's because that's what is there. And there are, younger filmmakers coming up now, and there's even like people like Karen Skloss, who's done The Honor Farm, but they still didn't film necessarily in Austin, and it's about movies that are set in Austin. And so due to the the content, there weren't that many chances to film and interview women, and so it was really cool that like this badass woman, like
Yes.
badass, and she's just so kind. And I had to, as soon as we finished the interview, I had to go to like help set up my best friend's birthday. I saw Elizabeth Avian weirdly a week later, and she said, "How was your friend's birthday?" Like she was so kind, and I was like, I can't believe you remember A, who I am, and B, anything about my life, but thank you. And yeah, so that was very cool.
That's awesome.
It's an interesting thing in Austin, and I don't think this is the case elsewhere, but there's a lot of female producers in Austin. And so you have Elizabeth Avian, her films have grossed $1 billion, over time. Ginger Sledge, who appears in the film, she's probably produced half of Linklater's films, starting with Suburbia. She did Bernie, she did Everybody Wants Some, and his two most recent films. She, was like an associate producer, I think, on Miss Congeniality. I mean, she worked her way up from like a production assistant to badass producer, and she's kind as can be and also tough as nails, and Sarah Green, who produces Jeff Nichols and Terrence Malick, lives half-time in Austin. And so I don't know what it is about it, but there's a lot of really high-powered female film producers in the city.
And I misspoke earlier, like I said premier female producer. One of the premier action producers of our time, period, is Elizabeth Avian. But we are where we are, and we're moving forward. Yeah. So it's all good. But I did want to touch on something that you guys let me know just before this. Your editor is on her way, and you had a principally female crew, yeah?
Many times, yes, because our primary location sound person is Virginia Rowland, Ginny Rowland, female. Laura Caldwell, who's our editor, female. Our assistant editor, Tricia Torley. Bailey Mata Crane was a production assistant, an editorial assistant, my assistant for a while, and now does our design. So the core of the film, our sound, the other guy who did location sound was Ginny's husband, Justin, and he also does the sound design for the film. And so, it's probably 2/3 women. Cinematographer is male, but probably 2/3 of the main people involved.
For the longest time, like I went to film school, and of course, I mean, a film school never blocks you from whatever you want to study. You study whatever you like to study. But there was always this kind of like, oh, well, the guys kind of emphasize these and the women kind of emphasize these. So it's nice to see that that kind of boundary sort of coming down, and you guys moving forward through that. So good on you.
Yeah, and the Austin Film Society plays a huge role in this. They are the fiscal sponsors of the film, but also most of the people that worked on the film came through the Austin Film Society's apprentice program. And so both Lara and Laura met each other through that.
Yeah, and Tricia, the assistant.
And Tricia. And then Bailey came through the UT's radio, television, film program.
Sure.
And so the great thing is you have essentially, these programs are sort of spitting people out, and there's not necessarily enough jobs all the time for them to fill. And so people who are very talented, may have been doing great trailers for Austin Film Society screenings and things like that, don't necessarily have a place to ply their trade, and they're like, oh, this sounds like a cool creative project, and I could cut my teeth on it. So it's most of the people involved, it's their first time with that feature credit. I've never directed a film before. I've produced them. Laura's first time associate producer. Laura Caldwell's first time feature editor. She's been assistant editor on some of Byington's work and others. And Chris Phelps, first time cinematographer. He's now shooting major country music videos.
I would never have guessed that he was a first timer because those interviews looked beautiful.
Oh, good. Yeah. So mistakes were made in the filming of the project, but we're pretty happy with how it's come out.
Yeah. Well, before we go, you've mentioned AFS several times, and not everyone in Dallas is familiar with that, but the Austin Film Society is really a tremendous organization and resource for Austin filmmakers. So tell us a little bit more about that and how they supported you.
Yeah, so I served on the board of the organization as board president for a couple terms, and we have term limits, which is great. But it does a variety of things. So it has a studio lot that it runs that we feature in the movie. Miss Congeniality was the first to ever use that lot in a film. And then there's education programs. There's a cinema where it has a 2-screen full-time theater that runs. And honestly, it's a scene. You know, once you meet people, Richard Linklater is the founder of the organization. He's there at the cinema. You can hang out with him in the lobby. He shows films that he likes, and they're sometimes hardcore French films, you know, or it's like real quirky 80s stuff, and talks after them. So he's sort of, I would say, sets the standard of what the Film Society should be, which is very non-pretentious, slightly geeky, I guess you would say, in the interest, you know, like I've received my education of film a lot through the Austin Film Society and the films that are shown there.
Yeah.
And so it's not just about going out and making films, it's about appreciating them.
Yeah, and it just kind of, it creates a culture. It's almost like a church, I feel like. That's the cinema especially, just because Bujalski, Bob Byington, the Zellners, all of these people are at these movies all of the time, watching them and hanging out afterwards and talking. And so and people can go up and talk to them and discuss films with them. And a lot of people, when they move to Austin and ask, like, how do I get involved? I just say, like, either do the internship at the Austin Film Society or just go to movies there, because you learn a lot. And then there are just people there. And I did the internship program, and so many people I know have. And you find your people that you really get along with, that you have movies in common with, and those people a lot of the time have been starting to make their own music videos or films, and it's really exciting because it creates a culture that just keeps going and growing. So
awesome. Well, Mike and Laura, we're honored to have you both here, honored to have also starring Austin here, and thank you guys for taking a few minutes to sit down with us. Hope you have a ton of fun in Dallas.
Got it. Thank you.